Johnny Ringo was found under a scrub oak tree in Arizona's West Turquoise Mountain Country on the afternoon of July 14, 1882. He had a bullet wound in his right temple. His horse was gone. A strip of his undershirt had been torn off and wrapped around his right foot, for reasons no one has ever explained to anyone's satisfaction. He was 32 years old. The coroner ruled it a suicide. What nobody could satisfactorily explain was the cartridge casing found near the body, from a different caliber than Ringo's own revolver, or the condition of the wound itself, which some observers noted appeared inconsistent with a self-inflicted shot, or why a man who supposedly shot himself in the head died with his revolver still cocked, a physical difficulty that several frontier lawmen found hard to explain. The death of Johnny Ringo has never been definitively solved, and the list of men who had both motive and capability to end him is not a long one. Near the top of it, then and now, is the name of a Georgia-born dentist who was already dying of tuberculosis and had long since concluded that the manner of his death was unlikely to be worse than the disease that was already killing him. John Henry Holliday, Doc. The relationship between Doc Holliday and Johnny Ringo is one of the most compelling pairings the American frontier produced, not because it was violent, though it was that, but because of what these two men represented when placed side by side. They were not simple outlaws. They were not products of poverty or ignorance or lack of opportunity. They were educated men who had been given every reasonable starting point that the mid-19th century could offer a young man in America, and they had both arrived, by different routes, at the same address, a territory where the law was a suggestion, a gun was an argument, and tomorrow was not something to bank on. Johnny Ringo understood Doc Holliday in a way that almost no one else in the West did, because Ringo was looking at a version of himself, a version that had chosen different loyalties and arrived at a different kind of doom. What Ringo recognized in Holliday was the warning he himself embodied. A man of education, intelligence, and genuine capability pointed entirely in the wrong direction and past caring about it. That warning, it turned out, was the most dangerous thing the American frontier ever produced. John Henry Holliday was born in Griffin, Georgia in August of 1851 into exactly the kind of family that the antebellum South considered respectable. His father was a pharmacist and a veteran, his mother a woman of some education who died of tuberculosis when John was 15, a death that would haunt the rest of his life in the most literal biological sense. He was educated in classical subjects, studied Latin, and in 1870 enrolled in the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in Philadelphia. He graduated in 1872, 20 years old, with a legitimate professional degree and every reasonable expectation of a settled professional life in the South. Then came the diagnosis: tuberculosis, the same disease that had taken his mother. In the medical understanding of the 1870s, the dry air of the Western Territories was the most effective available treatment. Not a cure, because there was no cure, but a possible prolongation. Holliday moved west. He opened dental practices in Dallas, in Dodge City, in various frontier towns where the profession of extracting teeth competed with the profession of extracting money from men who played cards. The dental work declined as the gambling advanced. The tuberculosis progressed regardless. What the diagnosis did to Holliday's psychology has been the subject of considerable speculation, but the observable behavior tells a coherent story. A man who has been told he is dying by a slow and unpleasant disease, and who is told this in his early 20s, has a set of choices. He can rail against it, he can deny it, he can accept it quietly and spend whatever time remains in careful, diminished living. Or he can decide that if the outcome is already determined, the manner of getting there is the only variable left, and proceed to make every day as much itself as possible, regardless of the consequences. Holliday appears to have chosen something in the vicinity of the last option. He drank heavily, which accelerated the disease and probably shortened his life. He gambled compulsively. He picked fights with people who were armed, which under ordinary risk assessment would seem unwise, except that for a man already dying of tuberculosis, the risk calculation looks different than it does for the rest of us. A bullet was in some respects a faster exit than what he already had waiting. He was also, by every reliable account, genuinely dangerous with a gun. Not in the theatrical, performative way of frontier mythology, but in the specific, practical way of a man who had decided that speed and accuracy were worth developing because they were likely to be necessary. The frontier distinction between men whose danger came from recklessness and men who were dangerous because they were skilled and calm was a real one, and Holliday was in the second category. He was not large, he was frequently ill. He often arrived at confrontations already weakened by coughing. None of it particularly mattered, because what he brought to those confrontations was something most of his opponents didn't have: a mind accustomed to operating precisely under pressure, and a relationship with his own mortality that removed the fear most men carried into a gunfight. John Peters Ringo arrived at a similar place through a different map. He was born in Indiana in 1850, moved with his family to California, and carried with him an education that stood out sharply against the background of frontier outlawry. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man who read widely, who could hold a conversation in Latin when the mood struck him, and who presented himself with a bearing that spoke of a background considerably more refined than the company he kept. How exactly a man of that description ended up riding with the Cochise County Cowboys, the loose outlaw confederacy that constituted the primary organized criminal presence in southern Arizona in the early 1880s, is a question the historical record answers cleanly. The Mason County War in Texas in the mid-1870s left a mark on Ringo's biography that doesn't entirely account for the trajectory that followed, but it established the pattern. Violence, flight, reinvention, and then more violence. By the time Ringo arrived in Tombstone's orbit in the early 1880s, he had a reputation that preceded him, and a drinking problem that had moved well past the social into the structural. Men who knew him in this period left accounts that are consistent in a specific detail. Ringo was intelligent enough to be aware of what he had become, and that awareness appeared to make him worse rather than better. There is a particular kind of self-destruction that runs on clarity rather than confusion, where the man going under can see exactly where he is headed and proceeds anyway, because stopping seems to require an energy or a reason that isn't there anymore. Ringo appears to have been that kind of man, which is exactly what made the Holliday-Ringo dynamic so charged. They recognized each other. In the existing historical record, the direct encounters between them are sparse and contested. The famous confrontation described in various later accounts, where the two men faced each other in the street and exchanged something more intellectually pointed than the average Tombstone standoff, may be embellished, may be entirely fabricated, or may be an accurate account that survived in distorted form. What is historically established is that Ringo and Holliday moved in the same physical geography during the same years, that they were aligned with opposing factions in the conflict that would become known as the Cochise County War, and that their mutual regard appears to have been genuine, if expressed in the way that dangerous men in dangerous places tend to express such things, through a kind of careful, armed respect that acknowledged the other man as someone not to be taken lightly. The Cochise County conflict, which produced the events that Tombstone of popular memory is built around, was not fundamentally a story about good men and bad men, though that is how it tends to be told. It was a story about competing economic and political interests in a territory where the institutions that normally mediate such conflicts were either absent, corrupt, or contested. The Earp faction, which Holliday attached himself to through his friendship with Wyatt, represented one set of interests. The Cowboys, which included Ringo among their more notable members, represented another. The violence that erupted between them, the gunfight near the OK Corral in October 1881, and the sequence of killings that followed through the winter and spring of 1882, was the product of those interests colliding in a place where collisions were settled with guns rather than lawyers. Holliday's role at the OK Corral has been analyzed from every available angle over a century, What happened in about 30 seconds of gunfire in the afternoon of October 26, 1881, is still disputed in its specifics. Where exactly everyone stood, who fired first, whether some of the cowboys were attempting to surrender, all of it remains contested in the historical record, argued across competing witness testimonies and conflicting physical evidence. What is not disputed is that Holliday was there, that he was sick enough that morning that witnesses later said they were surprised he could stand, and that he performed under that pressure with exactly the controlled efficiency that his reputation suggested he would. 3 members of the cowboy faction were dead when the smoke cleared. High Clanton, who had been loudest in the preceding days about what was going to happen to the Erbs, fled the scene without firing a shot. Several members of the Erb Holliday party were wounded. Ringo was not present at the corral that day, but the killing did not stop there, and what followed through the winter of 1881 to 1882 drew both men further into the conflict. Morgan Earp was murdered at a billiard table in March 1882. Virgil Earp, already crippled from an earlier assassination attempt, was no longer an effective force. Wyatt, with Holliday and a small group of others, launched what became known as the Vendetta Ride, a deliberate, systematic search for the men responsible for Morgan's death. The ride ended with several of the suspected conspirators dead and the Earp party leaving Arizona territory under circumstances that made return inadvisable. Ringo, who had not been among the men Wyatt killed, remained. He didn't remain long. 4 months after the Vendetta ride ended, Ringo was found under that scrub oak with a bullet in his head and no explanation that satisfied anyone. The suicide ruling was the path of least resistance for an Arizona inquest that had neither the means nor the particular motivation to investigate more aggressively. The alternative explanations have never been established definitively. Doc Holliday, in subsequent years, is reported to have made statements suggesting he knew more about Ringo's death than a man who wasn't there would know. Those statements are not documented in any form that would satisfy a court, and they may have been the product of a man who understood the value of a reputation and saw no reason to undermine one. Or they may have been the truth. What matters about Ringo's death, for the purposes of understanding what he represented, is not the mechanism, but the trajectory. He was 32 years old. He was found alone in rough country with no apparent purpose for being where he was. The strip of undershirt around his foot suggests disorientation or injury or something else that nobody has ever satisfactorily explained. He had been drinking heavily in the days before his death, heavily enough that the people who encountered him in the final week described a man who was not fully tracking the world around him in the way that a man in his position needed to track it. The man who quoted Latin in frontier saloons and whose intelligence multiple contemporaries noted as unusual for his circumstances arrived by whatever route at a solitary end in rough Arizona country with no witness, no explanation, and a wound that the available evidence did not cleanly assign to his own hand. Holliday died 5 years later in a bed in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. The tuberculosis finally completed what it had been working on since his 20s. He died in the morning, looked at his bare feet, and said, according to the account that has come down through the people who were with him, that this was funny. What was funny, those present understood, was that he had always expected to die in a gunfight. He had spent 15 years constructing a life around the premise that a bullet was coming for him before the disease could finish its work. The disease finished its work. He was 36 years old. The comparison between these two men reveals something about the frontier that the conventional mythology obscures. The West of popular imagination is populated by a fairly limited caste: the lawman, the outlaw, the farmer, the gambler, the hired gun. What Doc Holliday and Johnny Ringo represent is a category that doesn't fit cleanly into any of those. The educated man who ended up on the frontier not because he was pushed there by poverty or ignorance, but because something in his life had removed the conventional reasons to pursue the conventional path. For Holliday, it was the tuberculosis. For Ringo, the evidence suggests it was something less clinical and more psychological. A decision or a drift away from the life his education had prepared him for towards something that offered intensity at the cost of duration. Both men were brilliant in the specific ways that the frontier rewarded. Fast, calm under pressure, capable of reading a room and understanding exactly where the danger was positioned. Both men were destroyed by the specific ways the frontier punished: the drinking, the violence, the absence of the ordinary social structures that give most lives their shape and their reason for continuing. The difference between them was not intelligence or capability, it was attachment. Holliday had Wyatt Earp, a friendship so unlikely and so durable that historians have spent decades trying to fully explain it. That friendship gave Holliday something to be loyal to outside himself, and loyalty, it turns out, is one of the things that keeps a man going when the internal reasons have run thin. Ringo had the Cowboys, which was not the same thing. The Cowboys were a loose affiliation of men with overlapping criminal interests, not a community in any meaningful sense. There was no one in the organization whose regard for Ringo ran deep enough to constitute a reason. When the Cochise conflict broke down and the various factions scattered, Ringo was left with what he had been left with for most of his adult life: himself, his intelligence, his drinking, and the growing awareness that the distance between where he was and where he might have been was not going to close. Doc Holliday warned us about Johnny Ringo the way a rough draft warns you about the finished version. Both men were writing the same story: educated, capable, doomed, the frontier burning off whatever future they might have had in more ordinary circumstances. But Holliday wrote his version with a loyalty that gave it shape, a friendship that gave it direction, and a particular sardonic wit that made it, against all reasonable expectation, something worth remembering. Ringo wrote his version alone, without the attachment that might have changed the ending, and arrived at an oak tree in the Arizona heat with no one to say anything funny at the close. The frontier had no shortage of violent men. It produced them in quantity, used them and discarded them with an efficiency that the mythology built up around places like Tombstone tends to romanticize away. Most of them left no record beyond a line in a newspaper or a name on a cemetery marker. What it produced rarely was the combination that both Holliday and Ringo represented: the violent man who was also capable of understanding with full clarity exactly who he was and what he was doing. Most men who lived by the gun either never had the intellectual equipment to fully reckon with their situation, or they had it and found ways not to look directly at it. Holliday looked directly at it and kept his sense of humor. Ringo looked at the same thing and kept drinking. That is what Ringo warned us about, not that Doc Holliday was dangerous. Everyone in the Arizona territory already knew that. What Ringo warned us about was the specific combination of gifts and damage that produced a man like Holliday, what it costs, what it requires, and what it does to a person over time. Ringo was the outcome when those gifts and that damage ran without anchor. Holliday was the outcome when one improbable friendship provided just enough reason to keep the whole thing moving forward. One of them died alone under a tree with an unexplained strip of cloth wrapped around his foot in the dust. The other died in a bed, glanced down at his feet, and found something worth laughing at. The difference between those two endings is not as large as it looks, but it was everything.